Chapter 1. The Artemis Reach shuddered through its hull, metal joints screaming against the vacuum as landing struts punched through regolith with mechanical finality. Pale dust erupted in slow, ghostly columns that hung suspended before gravity claimed them, each grain settling with the patience of geological time. Captain Elara Voss pressed her spine against the command seat, fingers locked around the armrest until the polymer creaked. Her breathing came measured and controlled, each exhale fogging her visor before the recyclers cleared it away. Beside her, Anwar Singh's dark eyes widened behind his faceplate, drinking in the expanding vista of Mare Imbrium's pocked horizon. The crater walls stretched like broken teeth against star-drunk blackness, and his breath caught audibly over comms a sound that scraped against Alara's nerves. Jesus Christ, Singh whispered, and the blasphemy hung in the recycled air between them. The module settled with a thunk that reverberated through the deck plating before dissolving into something worse than silence, an absence so complete it felt predatory, as though the void itself crouched just beyond their thin metal shell. Dr. Marcus Cade muttered something in Spanish, his words tumbling over each other like prayer beads. Silva Reyes snorted and tapped her oxygen display, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Noventa y tres por ciento, Cade whispered, and his voice carried the tremor of a man touching something sacred. Elara cut through their awe like a blade. Checklist. Her tone brooked no wonder, no philosophy. Singh's shoulders straightened reflexively, and even Reyes's smirk faltered as they turned to their instruments. The captain's breathing had steadied to the rhythm of protocol, each inhalation a denial of the vast emptiness pressing against their hull. The outer hatch hissed open with mechanical precision, equalizing into vacuum with a sound like the universe inhaling. Moon dust spiraled upward in the escaping atmosphere before dropping straight down, each mote obeying Newton's laws with merciless clarity. Against the backdrop of Earth's blue-white crescent, impossibly small, impossibly distant, Singh froze halfway down the ladder. "It's beautiful," he breathed into comms, and the words seemed to crack something in the air around them. Elara remained in the cabin, her helmet display casting green shadows across her angular features. She tapped the screen with sharp, impatient gestures, each movement radiating controlled tension. Her jaw worked beneath the faceplate as Singh lingered on the ladder, transfixed by the desolation spreading before them. "Singh, move," the order cracked like a whip. Singh flinched and continued his descent, boots finding purchase on rungs that had never known weather, never known time beyond the brutal cycle of day and night that carved this place. Reyes jumped the last meter, her boots kicking up a perfect halo of silver dust that caught the earthlight and scattered it like broken glass. She landed with the confidence of someone who trusted physics more than poetry, already turning to unload equipment before her footprints had finished settling. Cade descended with reverence, his gloved fingers trailing along the ladder rails as though touching the bones of some vast, sleeping god. Each contact point left smudges on the pristine metal, and he paused at the bottom to stare at his own handprints with something approaching worship. Elara came last, each step measured and rigid, her silhouette cutting a stark line against the endless gray horizon. Authority radiated from her posture even here, in this place where authority meant nothing to the ancient stones and waiting craters. Her visor fogged slightly with each breath, betraying the only sign that she felt the weight of this moment pressing down through her bones. Their boots carved clean prints across untouched regolith, each step writing a sentence in a language the moon had never learned. The trails stretched behind them like unfinished thoughts, connecting them to their metal sanctuary with fragile threads of disturbed dust. Singh raised one arm toward the earth above, aligning his shadow with the blue-white glow, and his laughter crackled through comms with a manic edge. "Look at that," he said, voice climbing toward hysteria. "We're standing on the moon, and Earth looks like a marble someone dropped in tar." Elara's response cut through his wonder. "Maintain bearing 270. We have work to do." The correction landed with military precision, and Singh's arm dropped. His laughter died in the recycled air of his suit, leaving only the sound of regulated breathing and the faint hum of life support systems keeping them tethered to existence. Ray's worked with mechanical efficiency, unloading the ground-penetrating sensor from its foam-lined case. The unit gleamed with fresh manufacture, its surfaces unmarked by the wear that would come if they survived this mission. She handled it like a familiar tool, cables and connectors finding their places with practiced ease. Cade hovered over the sensor's orientation, fumbling with compass overlays on his wrist display. "It needs to point exactly north," he muttered, adjusting and readjusting with trembling hands. The magnetic field readings won't calibrate properly unless Elara strode over and twisted the unit with a single, decisive motion. Dust cascaded from its base like sand through an hourglass, and she brushed it away with sharp, impatient strokes. "It's aligned." Her tone suggested the conversation had ended before it began. Cade's hands fell to his sides, and he stepped back as though she'd slapped him. Singh jogged toward the crater's rim, his movements taking on the strange, floating quality of lunar gravity. Each step carried him farther than intended, dust clouds swirling around his ankles like smoke. At the edge, he peered down into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself, his voice rising with dangerous excitement. "The formations down there, they're catching the earthlight like crystal, like the whole crater's lined with mirrors." Elara's jaw tightened beneath her visor. Her body went rigid, every line of her posture broadcasting command authority across the empty landscape. "Sing, formation, now." But Singh lingered, drawn by the glittering darkness below, his silhouette wavering against the star field like something already half dissolved into the void. The dust around his boots continued to swirl, creating halos of movement in a place where nothing should move, nothing should change. For a heartbeat that stretched like a held note, Elara lifted her visor toward Earth. The blue-white sphere hung suspended in perfect blackness, half-veiled in the shadow that swept across continents with clockwork precision. Impossibly small, impossibly fragile. And suddenly, unbidden, Myra's face flashed across her memory, dark eyes crinkling with laughter, lips curved around words she would never hear again. The moment stuttered her composure like a missed step. Her breath came ragged, fogging her visor as something cracked in the armor she'd built around herself. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hairline fracture. "Raise systems update." The words came too sharp, too fast, betraying the control that threatened to slip through her fingers like moon dust. Cade dropped to his knees beside the sensor array, pressing his helmet against the ground as though he could hear something through layers of vacuum and stone. The gesture looked like prayer or desperation or both. "It's too quiet," he whispered, and his voice carried across comms with the weight of prophecy. "Even for space, it's too quiet." Elara stared down at him, her reflection warped and ghostly in his curved visor. For a moment she saw herself as he must see her, a dark silhouette against stars, faceless and implacable as the void itself. "This mission doesn't allow mysticism, Doctor." The words came like ice, clipping his wonder into silence and leaving only the sound of regulated breathing and the vast, hungry quiet that pressed against their suits from all directions. The crew regrouped beside Artemis Reach, their footprints spiderwebbing outward across the barren surface like cracks in glass. The silence stretched between them, unnervingly complete, broken only by the soft whisper of recycled air and the faint electronic hum of systems maintaining their tenuous grip on life. Elara marked grid coordinates on her wrist tablet, her movements sharp and purposeful, but her body remained taut as she faced the crater's dark rim, as though daring the emptiness to answer back. Already something had shifted. The standoff had begun, her silence against the moon's silence, authority against indifference, the desperate human need for meaning pressing against a universe that offered none. In the distance, Earth continued its slow rotation, blue and white and utterly unreachable, while four figures stood like insects on the surface of a world that had been waiting in darkness for 4 billion years. Chapter 2. The drill rig landed with mechanical precision, silver legs punching through regolith that puffed upward in lazy clouds before settling into perfect stillness. Silver rays guided the tripod's descent with practiced efficiency, each adjustment calculated and sure. The powdery surface yielded beneath the weight, legs sinking until they found purchase against harder substrate below. Captain Elara Voss moved to steady the assembly, her gloved hands gripping the frame with controlled force that made the metal sing faintly through her suit's haptic feedback. Earth's pale crescent reflected in her visor like a distant memory, blue and white against the star-drunk blackness that stretched beyond the crater's rim. Around them, the only sound was the mechanical whisper of life support systems' oxygen recyclers humming their quiet song of survival while four humans prepared to wound the moon. Stable, Rays announced, stepping back to survey their work. The drill stood like a chrome insect against the gray wasteland, its bit gleaming with fresh manufacture that seemed obscene in this ancient place. Dr. Marcus Cade dropped into a crouch beside the sensor array, balancing his scanner across one thigh while data cascaded across its screen in stuttering waves. Numbers spiked and plummeted with erratic intensity that made his breathing quicken inside his helmet. Unstable strata, he muttered, voice carrying the tremor of a man reading prophecy. The density readings, they're fluctuating like theirs. I need efficiency, doctor, not speculation. Elara's words cut through his wonder with surgical precision, leaving silence in their wake. Cade's shoulders hunched as though struck, but his eyes remained fixed on the scanner's chaotic display. Anwar Singh knelt over the data tablet tethered to the drill's base, brushing away granules of moon dust that clung to the screen with static persistence. Each grain caught Earthlight and scattered it like tiny stars, creating constellations across the device's surface that shifted with every movement of his gloves. His breathing quickened, audible through comms as a series of shallow gasps that suggested anticipation rather than fear. The preliminary readings, Singh whispered, glancing toward the crater's yawning darkness. If Cade's right about the cavern system, his voice carried the tremor of someone unwrapping a gift that might contain either treasure or catastrophe. Above them, the crater's lip curved against stars like the rim of a vast bowl designed to catch falling light. The silence pressed down with the weight of eons, making each breath feel stolen from the vacuum that waited beyond their suits' thin shells. Reyes positioned herself at the control panel, her movements sharp and decisive. Everyone clear the bore sight. Her hand hovered over the ignition switch like a surgeon's blade above skin, initiating drill sequence in 3, 2. She slammed the switch. The drill exploded to life with a roar that seemed impossible in airless space, transmitted through the ground into their boots as pure vibration. The bit carved downward, sending sprays of gray dust fountaining upward to coat their visors and suits in lunar debris. The regolith offered little resistance to the powdery surface, giving way to harder layers that the diamond-tipped bit devoured with mechanical hunger. Elara's fingers curled around her wrist tablet until the polymer case creaked, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. The vibration traveled up through her bones, setting her teeth on edge as she watched depth readings climb on her display. 30 meters, 50, 75, then the bit struck emptiness. The drill lurched as resistance vanished, its motor screaming as it bit into void rather than stone. A sharp echo reverberated upward through the shaft, the toll of some vast, buried bell awakened after geological ages of sleep. Dust plumes lifted from the borehole and hung suspended in the weak gravity, defying physics with their unnatural stillness. All four astronauts froze in perfect synchrony, chests heaving against their suits as though the moon itself had drawn breath. The echo faded, leaving behind a quality of silence that felt different than expected, as if the darkness below were listening. Cavern confirmed, Reyes whispered, but her voice carried no triumph. A low-frequency resonance began to build in the depths, climbing through rock and metal and into their bodies. It vibrated their helmet visors, setting up standing waves in their recycled air that made speech feel thick and strange. The moon, that silent, airless tomb, had found its voice. Singh stumbled backward, boots crunching against powder that seemed to shift beneath him with unnatural fluidity. His laughter crackled through calms, high and brittle, before dissolving into something that might have been a sob. "Do you hear that? It's singing. The whole moon is singing." Static began to bleed through their communications, interference patterns that resolved into something far worse than electromagnetic noise. Voices emerged from the crackling, human voices, layered and overlapping in impossible harmony. They whispered and called and pleaded, creating polyphonic structures that no airless void should contain. Cade tore his censer from the drill mount and held it aloft like an offering to invisible gods. His breathing came in ragged gasps that fogged his visor as data streams painted impossible readings across his scanner. "It's responding," he cried, voice cracking with ecstasy or terror. "The resonance frequency, it's amplifying our signals and sending them back modulated, as if what?" Elara's words came sharp as breaking glass. "As if something down there is learning to speak." The voices swelled, weaving together into harmonies that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly through bone and brain tissue. Ray's clapped gloved hands to her helmet as though sound could be blocked by physical barriers, though the singing came through their communications systems, through the very air they breathed. Singh muttered names between gasps: Maria, Carlos, little Anna, family members lost years ago in the collapse that had driven him to space. His voice carried the weight of recognition, as though their faces materialized in the singing darkness below. "They're not there," Elara snapped, but her own voice wavered as the chorus continued to build. Among the layered voices, one began to separate from the rest, higher, sharper, carrying the unmistakable tremor of childhood. It rose above the polyphonic mass like a blade cutting silk, crystalline and pure and impossible. "Mother," the word emerged with perfect clarity, slicing through the cacophony to strike Elara like a physical blow. She froze mid-step, breath fogging in jagged bursts against her visor as her gloved hand pressed hard against her chest. The pressure felt like drowning in reverse air trapped inside her lungs while vacuum pressed from without. "Not here. Not now," not Myra's voice calling from a place that should hold only stone and silence. "Mother, where are you?" The crew turned as one toward their captain, bodies reflecting shared terror at the sound none could deny. Even through their suits, the recognition was visible, shoulders tight, movements jerky with the automatism of prey animals sensing predators just beyond the firelight. Alara's helmet lamp swung across the cavern's mouth, its beam probing depths that seemed to swallow photons and give back only darkness. But the quality of that darkness had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded, as though an audience had been waiting in those depths, watching through geological ages for someone to finally hear their performance. The Mare Imbrium's ancient silence had shattered like glass, leaving behind something far worse: the knowledge that they had never been alone, that the moon had been singing all along, waiting for ears that could finally hear its song. And in that song, impossibly, were the voices of everyone they had ever lost. Chapter 3, the recording unit settled into the regolith with mechanical precision, its chrome housing reflecting earthlight in fractured patterns across the disturbed dust. Dr. Cade positioned it with reverent care near the drill shaft's gaping mouth, each movement deliberate as a priest arranging altar pieces. The device's red recording light began to pulse, casting bloody shadows that danced across the gray surface like a heartbeat made visible. Behind the recorder, the cavern opening waited, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow their helmet lamps' beams without reflection. The void pulled at their vision like a drain, making depth impossible to judge. It could descend 10 meters or 10,000, The darkness offered no clues, only patient expectation. A faint vibration rippled through the lunar surface, transmitted up through the soles of their boots as subsonic tremors that seemed to originate from somewhere impossibly deep. The sensation crawled up their spines, setting nerves on edge despite the vacuum that should have carried no sound. Silva Reyes stepped closer to the drill rig, her gloved hands finding the metal frame for support. Her knuckles went white inside the suit's joints as she leaned toward her communications microphone. When she spoke, her voice carried the controlled tremor of someone standing at the edge of an abyss. Identify yourself. The words dropped into the cavern like stones into deep water, swallowed by darkness that gave back nothing. Silence stretched between them, not the clean emptiness of space, but something pregnant with potential response. Long enough for rational minds to dismiss the voices as equipment malfunction or stress-induced hallucination. Long enough for hope to curdle into dread. Then the answer came. The voice that filtered through their communications was not alien that would have been mercy. Instead, it carried the devastating intimacy of recognition, words shaped by voices they had kissed goodnight, had argued with, and had mourned. Reyes staggered as her mother's voice emerged from the static, low and melodic, weaving lullabies she hadn't heard since childhood. Mija, pourquoi Laura's, the monsters can't reach you here. Her helmet lamp trembled in her grasp, scattering wild arcs of light across the crater walls as her body betrayed the control she fought to maintain. The Spanish words carried perfect inflection, down to the slight rasp her mother had developed in her final years, the way she'd whispered comfort through hospital walls that smelled of antiseptic and dying hope. Sing's laughter burst through the comms, involuntary, incredulous, the sound of a mind rejecting impossible input. But the laughter died in his throat as the voice in his headset shifted, resolving into his brother's distinct chuckle, unbroken from memory despite the cancer that had stolen it years ago. Anwar, you always were scared of heights. Remember the roof, remember how I caught you when you fell. The data tablet slipped from Singh's nerveless fingers, striking the regolith with a muffled impact that cracked its screen into spiderweb patterns. His breath came in uneven bursts, fogging his visor as his chest worked against the suit's constraints. The sound of his brother's voice not as it had become in those final months, but as it was in childhood, clear and strong and impossibly alive. Captain Elara Voss stood rigid apart from her crew, chin locked in an expression that suggested absolute control. But every nerve strained beneath that facade, waiting for the voices to turn their attention to her, to speak the name she couldn't bear to hear. Her gloved fingers twitched against her tablet stylus, the only visible sign of the panic that clawed at her composure like something trying to escape from inside her chest. Dr. Cade moved closer to the recording unit, his breathing ragged with excitement and terror in equal measure. He spoke with deliberate cadence, each word precisely enunciated, as though addressing a scientific instrument rather than the impossible chorus rising from lunar depths. What is your purpose? The response came instantly, spoken in Cade's own voice but multiplied, layered into harmonic structures that suggested 1,000 voices speaking in perfect unison. The words carried his exact inflection, his slight Mexican accent, even the way he emphasized consonants when conducting formal interviews. But beneath the familiarity lurked something vast and hungry, as though the cavern had swallowed his voice and given birth to infinite copies. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? What is your purpose? The phrase cascaded through octaves, weaving itself into complex patterns that shouldn't exist in airless space. Each repetition felt like an accusation, a question turned back on itself until meaning dissolved into pure sound. Then the communications erupted. Ray's lullaby voice overlapped Singh's brother's laughter, which folded into Cade's multiplied questioning. The sounds didn't collapse into chaos. Instead, they wove together with uncanny precision, each phrase stitched into rhythmic resonance that suggested deliberate composition rather than random noise. The cavern walls seemed to glow faintly under their helmet lamps, stone surfaces vibrating with sympathetic harmonics as though the entire crater had become a resonating chamber. Ray's collapsed onto her knees, pounding gloved fists against her helmet as though she could physically dislodge her mother's voice from her skull. The impacts transmitted through her suit's structure as dull thuds that mixed with her sobbing breath. "Stop it," she whispered, then screamed. "Stop it." Singh stumbled backward, boots skidding in loose regolith as he tried to escape the sound of his brother's voice calling his name with infinite patience. His hand swept across his visor as though wiping away tears that couldn't fall in vacuum, the gesture desperate and futile and heartbreakingly human against the lunar desolation. Despite the weightless calm of their environment, every movement felt heavy with desperation, choking on the recycled air that suddenly seemed too thin, too processed, too far from anything that had ever supported actual life. The voices edged closer to Elara now, bending into half-familiar cadences that made her pulse hammer against her throat, almost Myra's inflection, almost her way of drawing out vowels when she was sleepy, almost the laugh that had filled their apartment with light before the accident stole everything worth hearing. Elara's face remained locked in its mask of command, but her eyes flicked rapidly across her visor to display oxygen levels, suit integrity, mission parameters, anything to distract from the growing pressure in her chest. In her silence, she chose paralysis, issuing no orders to advance or retreat, holding her crew suspended at the brink of revelation or destruction. The choir quieted with sudden, surgical precision. The absence gnawed worse than the presence had, like a held breath before judgment, like the pause between lightning and thunder when the world waits to learn if it will survive the storm. Only the hiss of life support systems remained in their ears, mechanical whispers that seemed pathetically fragile against the vast silence pressing in from all directions. Elara scanned her crew's faces through their visors, seeing grief etched in the tension around their eyes, in the way they held their shoulders against invisible weight. Ray's still knelt in the dust, her helmet tilted toward earth like a supplicant. Singh stood frozen with one hand extended, as though reaching for his brother's voice. Cade clutched his recorder with both hands, staring at its blinking light as though it might offer salvation or damnation with equal probability. Her gaze drifted back to the cavern's mouth unlit, expectant, wearing its darkness like a smile that knew secrets too terrible for the living to bear. Whatever waited in those depths had learned their voices, had tasted their grief, had found the frequency that made human hearts resonate with loss. And in the perfect silence that followed, Elara understood with clarity that the real descent was just beginning. Chapter 4, Captain Elara Voss twisted her helmet ring into place with mechanical precision, the seals engaging with a sharp hiss that cut through the silence like a blade. Pressurized oxygen flooded her suit with the familiar taste of recycled air, metallic, sterile, nothing like the wind that had once carried her daughter's laughter across their backyard. Her gloved fingers found the locking mechanism and tested it twice, muscle memory overriding the tremor that threatened to betray her composure. Dr. Cade's nervous energy translated into fidgeting with his communications frequency, cycling through channels that crackled with static interference. His breathing came in shallow bursts, fogging his visor despite the suit's climate controls. Each adjustment of the dial produced new harmonics from the depths below, as though the cavern were tuning itself to their presence. Silver Rays checked her harness straps with sharp, efficient tugs that made the webbing sing against her suit's hard shell. Each pull was measured, professional, but her knuckles stayed white inside her gloves long after the equipment passed inspection. The steel carabiners gleamed like surgical instruments in earthlight, cold and precise, and utterly inadequate for whatever waited in the darkness below. Anwar Singh managed a grin that looked carved from wax, his expression wavering as he stared into the cavern's mouth. The opening yawned before them, perfectly circular, walls disappearing into blackness that seemed to swallow their helmet lamp's beams before they could illuminate anything meaningful. His breathing quickened, audible through comms as rapid, shallow gasps that suggested impending hyperventilation. "Deep breaths, sing," Elara commanded, her voice cutting through his panic with practiced authority. "We descend by the numbers." Rays drove the steel piton into a regolith near the cavern's lip, her hammer blows transmitting through the ground as vibrations that seemed to wake something deeper. The metal sank into lunar soil with satisfying resistance until it seated against harder substrate. She clipped the tether line with movements that spoke of countless training hours, though her hands shook just enough to make the carabiner sing against the piton's eye. Singh clipped in first, his nervous energy translating into hurried movements that made the rope sway. He lowered himself over the edge, boots scraping against stone that gleamed like polished obsidian under his helmet lamps. The surface rippled faintly where his weight pressed against it, flexing like muscle beneath skin, though the visual suggested crystal formations catching and refracting light in impossible ways. "Surface composition anomalous," he reported, voice tight with controlled fear. "It's moving." Cade descended second, his gloved hand trailing along the curved wall with scientific fascination that overrode self-preservation instincts. The surface yielded beneath his touch, giving slightly like living tissue before firming again. Goosebumps rose visible on the back of his neck where his suit collar had shifted, exposing skin to the cavern's impossible influence. "It's alive," he whispered over comms, the words carrying reverence and terror in equal measure. "The molecular structure responds to contact, to pressure, to our presence." His voice dissolved into static as something deeper answered him, harmonics that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. Elara lowered herself last, movements sharp and economical, projecting confidence through every precise bootfall against the cavern walls. She planted each step with authority, as though commanding the stone to support her weight through sheer force of will. Her communications crackled with brusque instructions: maintain spacing, watch your lines, report any anomalies, but her breath hitched when the cavern hummed faintly beneath her footfalls. The sound echoed with dangerous familiarity, carrying the cadence of Myra's giggle when she'd hidden behind furniture during hide-and-seek. The memory struck like a physical impact, and Alara's cynicism cracked for just a moment before she forced it back into place with visible effort. As they descended, the tunnel widened in ways that defied architectural logic. Stone folded back on itself in Escher-like loops, creating perspectives that hurt to follow. The walls curved impossibly, suggesting spaces that couldn't exist within the moon's known geology. Helmet lamp beams bent at angles that made no sense, light scattering through what should have been solid stone as though the medium itself had changed. "This place shouldn't exist," Reyes muttered, her hands trembling on the rope as she tried to process impossible geometry. The structural integrity alone, her words cut off as the voices returned. They seeped into communications like audio blade, soft and layered and devastatingly personal. Reyes stiffened as her mother's lullaby threaded beneath the static Spanish words that carried the weight of bedtime stories and fever vigils and final goodbyes whispered through hospital corridors. Singh froze mid-step as his brother's laughter crackled through his headset, rich and warm and utterly impossible. The sound of summer afternoons and shared secrets and promises broken by mortality's cruel indifference. Cade gasped and began scribbling frantically with his wrist stylus against his tablet's glass surface, trying to capture patterns that seemed to shift even as he recorded them. The rhythm of the voices created harmonics that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension, like a language designed for minds that had evolved past human limitations. "Focus." "Formation," Elara barked, but each command was undercut by whispers in her ear, Myra's quiet, forgiving tone threading through the static like a promise of absolution. "It's okay, Mother. You tried your best." her gloved fists clenched white around the tether line, knuckles straining against the suit's joints as her jaw trembled behind her visor. When she spoke again, her words came out harder, angrier, each syllable forged in the furnace of crumbling certainty. Maintain discipline. Those are not your people down there. The tunnel contracted suddenly, stone walls pressing inward until they were forced to squeeze single file through a narrowing passage. The surfaces brushed their shoulders with faint vibration, flexing like living tissue that responded to their presence. Singh's panic erupted into hyperventilated whining through comms. They're touching me, it's touching me. He kicked against the walls, boots scraping stone that gave slightly under pressure, sending dust cascading in slow motion clouds. Get me out. Reyes grabbed his arm, pulling him steady through the bottleneck, though her helmet beam revealed the same panic reflected in her own wide eyes. The stone pulsed around them, breathing with their movements, alive in ways that violated everything they understood about planetary geology. The narrowing opened abruptly into a vaulting chamber that rose beyond their light's reach, shaped like a cathedral nave designed by minds that had never seen Earth's architecture. The ceiling shimmered with crystalline veins that pulsed faintly, carrying something that might have been bioluminescence or might have been something far stranger. Patterns etched into the walls resembled neural pathways, branching and reconnecting in networks that throbbed with subsonic rhythm. Cade rushed forward, his voice climbing toward hysteria. It's responding to us, it wants us to see. He threw his arms wide, helmet lamp scattering dazzling refractions across surfaces that gleamed like living glass. This is actual contact with something beyond terrestrial evolution. For a fleeting moment, awe outpaced fear. The chamber's impossible beauty suggested intelligence vast and patient, something that had waited geological ages for visitors capable of appreciating its artistry. The crystalline veins pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats, as though the cavern itself were learning to match their biological patterns. Elara's rigid form held at the chamber's entrance, her breathing quickening despite her efforts at control. Myra's voice drifted through the static like smoke, carrying promises that made her chest ache with possibilities too dangerous to consider. Almost home, Mother. I've been waiting for you to find me. The words hung in the recycled air of her helmet, sweet as poison, terrible as hope. Around them, the living cathedral waited with infinite patience for her to choose between command and surrender, between the duties that had defined her and the love that had destroyed her. In the depths below, something vast and patient continued its ancient song, weaving their voices into harmonies that spoke of reunion and recognition and the terrible price of finding what you thought you'd lost forever. Chapter 5. Dr. Cade dropped to his knees on the chamber floor, his wrist slate casting blue light across his helmet's interior as jagged audio waveforms cascaded across its screen. His fingers worked the display with manic intensity, overlaying spectral analysis onto the impossible chorus that surrounded them. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the suit's climate controls, each droplet refracting his visor light into tiny prisms. It's not chaos, he gasped, tapping the screen with urgent precision. The waveforms showed patterns of mathematical relationships hidden within the seemingly random voices. Look at these intervals: fifths, octaves, perfect harmonics. It's music theory, but more complex than anything we've composed. His breathing quickened as the implications struck him. The choir wasn't random emanation from some geological phenomenon. It was structured, intentional, composed by intelligence that understood harmony better than Bach. Cade's gloves came off with sharp tugs, his bare hands finding the environmental control panel inside his suit's chest plate. He pressed his palms against the smooth surface and clapped twice, the sound transmitting through his suit's speakers into comms with sharp precision. The choir paused. Silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours, broken only by the mechanical whisper of life support systems. Then the response came, two distinct hums layered in perfect harmony, matching his clap's rhythm with mathematical precision. The notes rose from every surface simultaneously, as though the cavern itself had learned to applaud. Cade laughed, the sound climbing toward hysteria as scientific wonder overwhelmed self-preservation instincts. It's actually learning our patterns and reflecting them back with harmonic elaboration. Silva Reyes hesitated at the chamber's edge, her engineering training warring with growing unease. She leaned toward her microphone and hummed a single, sustained note middle C, pure and simple as a tuning fork. Her voice trembled slightly, uncertain whether she was conducting an experiment or committing some cosmic transgression. The cavern responded immediately. The same note rose from crystalline veins that webbed the walls, but it didn't stop there. The tones split and multiplied, harmonizing with itself in thirds and fifths, creating chord progressions that seemed to emerge from the stone's molecular structure. Thin veins of crystal pulsed synchronously with each note, casting pale turquoise light that painted their faces in ethereal shades. Jesus, Reyes whispered, her tablet recording data streams that made no sense according to any physics she understood. The resonance frequency is impossible. There's no medium for sound transmission, but the harmonics are perfect. Anwar Singh leaned forward, his helmet tilted as though listening with his entire body. Fear drained from his posture, replaced by wonder that transformed his face behind the visor. His smile spread wide and childish. The expression of someone discovering magic was real after all. Carlos, he called into his microphone, speaking his brother's name like a prayer. His voice echoed through the chamber, mixing with the choir's endless harmonies. The response came as a whisper that made his knees buckle. Anwar, his brother's voice, perfect in every inflection, carried across impossible distances and time. Singh nearly collapsed in relief, one hand pressed against his chest as though trying to hold his heart inside his ribcage. The name repeated in layered harmonies, multiplying until it became a symphony of recognition. Captain Elara Voss felt her shoulders drop for the first time since landing. Her visor cleared as her breathing steadied, controlled exhalations that spoke of someone choosing to hope despite every instinct screaming warnings. She studied Cade's readouts, watching mathematical patterns emerge from chaos with the same precision that governed orbital mechanics. Maybe this was it. Maybe science could define the unexplainable, reduce cosmic mystery to equations and waveforms. Maybe they'd found something that could be understood rather than feared, communicated with rather than fled from. The possibility flickered in her chest like a match struck in darkness. Cade strode deeper into the chamber, his excitement uncontainable as he shouted tones and clapped complex rhythms, testing the choir's ability to process increasingly sophisticated musical structures. Each input produced richer responses, the voices learning and adapting with terrifying speed. His silhouette seemed lit from within as bioluminescent patterns in the walls responded to his presence. Augmented fourths, diminished sevenths. It understands dissonance and resolution. His voice cracked with wonder as the chamber transformed his simple melodies into symphonic arrangements that would have taken human composers lifetimes to conceive. Reyes forced a grin behind her visor, her tablet recording data streams that filled memory banks with impossible readings. But her hands trembled as her mother's lullaby began threading underneath the harmonic responses, Spanish words that carried the weight of childhood fever dreams and deathbed vigils. The distinction between experimental results and personal haunting blurred until she couldn't tell where science ended and science began. She didn't speak of it aloud. Some discoveries were too dangerous to share. Singh edged closer to a pulsing wall, his helmet beams scattering fractal refractions across his visor until the light seemed to contain infinite depth. "It knows me," he whispered, voice filled with religious awe. His hand hovered inches from vibrating mineral folds that flexed like living tissue. "It knows all of us, our voices, our losses, our need for contact. For a moment, he looked like he was praying rather than exploring, head bowed before mysteries that transcended human understanding. Elara's command voice cut through the chamber's growing euphoria. Enough experiments, secure your readings and pull back. Her tone carried brittle authority, each word carefully measured to project control she wasn't sure she still possessed. But the choir answered her in Myra's voice, soft, intimate, carrying the cadence of bedtime stories and morning kisses that had defined her world before the accident shattered everything. Stay, mother. I've been waiting so long for you to come home. Elara stiffened, her jaw quivering as command dissolved into silence. The words hit like physical blows, each syllable crafted to find the fractures in her armor and widen them until her carefully constructed authority crumbled into desperate need. As Reyes and Cade began gathering their equipment by the original drill site, Singh lingered in the chamber's depths, his body bathed in pale light that seemed to emanate from his very skin. His breathing calmed to an almost meditative rhythm as the choir hummed his brother's laughter in endless layers, each repetition perfect and devastating and impossible. Without speaking, without even seeming to choose, Singh reached down and unclipped his tether. The rope fell away with dreamlike slowness, its end disappearing into shadows that waited beyond their light's reach. He stepped toward the deeper mouth of the tunnel, movements fluid as sleepwalking, as though the cavern itself were drawing him forward through invisible threads. His communications crackled once, then merged seamlessly with the choir's harmony. His voice joined the endless song as though it had always been part of the composition, another instrument in an orchestra that spanned impossible distances between the living and the lost. Sing, Elara's shout echoed in the comms, but he was already gone, swallowed by darkness that sang with familiar voices. In the sudden silence that followed, the remaining crew understood with clarity that they had found something that wanted to be found, something that had been composing its song for geological ages, waiting for the right voices to complete the harmony. So now it had begun collecting them, one by one. Chapter 6, the narrowing shaft forced them into single file, helmet lamps carving desperate arcs across walls that pulsed with veins of crystalline growth. Captain Elara Voss led with rigid determination, each step measured and precise despite the way the stone's surface seemed to breathe beneath their boots. The walls shimmered with bioluminescent networks that reminded her of neural pathways, branching and reconnecting in patterns too complex to be natural, too purposeful to be random. Behind her, the remaining crew followed with the mechanical obedience of sleepwalkers. Each footfall felt heavier than the last, as though gravity itself grew denser the deeper they descended. The sensation defied physics' lunar gravity should remain constant regardless of depth, but their bodies registered the increasing pull that seemed to emanate from the cavern's heart. Dr. Cade halted so suddenly that Silva Reyes nearly collided with his back. His helmet beam swept across a section of wall where the stone's texture had changed, transformed from smooth crystal into something that resembled living tissue carved with impossible precision. Grooves etched the surface in fractal patterns that hurt to follow, each line branching into smaller lines that branched again, until the eye lost track of where the pattern ended and chaos began. "Look at this," he whispered, voice thick with scientific wonder and growing horror. The grooves flared with light when his beam touched them, phosphorescent fire racing along carved channels in pulsing intervals that synchronized perfectly with the voices bleeding through their communications. For a heartbeat, the pattern resembled something terrifyingly familiar. Skeletal hands reaching outward from the stone, fingers spread as though grasping for something just beyond reach. "Don't touch it," Elara commanded, but her words came too late. Silva Reyes had already pressed her trembling palm against the glowing wall, her engineer's curiosity overriding survival instincts. The moment her glove made contact, the grooves began to shift, flowing like liquid metal as they reformed themselves into something that made her breath catch in her throat. A woman's profile emerged from the chaos, delicate features carved in living light, eyes closed as though sleeping, lips slightly parted in eternal silence. The resemblance was unmistakable, devastating in its precision. "That's my mother," Reyes gasped, her helmet light flickering as the silhouette began to hum with impossible sound. The lullaby that had haunted her since first contact rose from the stone itself, Spanish words that carried the weight of childhood fevered dreams and deathbed vigils. Duum mija duum, los monstruos no puden tocart aqui. Cade's breathing came in ragged gasps as he recorded frantically on his slate, stylus dancing across the screen with manic precision. His field notes overlaid spectral analysis onto the phenomenon, revealing data streams that violated everything he understood about physics and biology. "It's not memory," he muttered, sweat gleaming on his face in the reflected light of his instruments. "It's memory residue, psychic imprints extracted and preserved in crystalline matrix. The entire chamber is a repository of human consciousness, fragments of minds that touched this place and left pieces behind." His voice climbed toward hysteria as the implications struck him. The choir wasn't creating these voices from nothing. It was weaving them from stolen fragments, emotional residue that had accumulated across centuries of human suffering and loss. The attention turned to Elara with predatory focus. Myra's voice spiraled through her headset, small and halting and absolutely perfect in its recreation of childhood terror. "Don't leave me in the dark, Mother. Please don't leave me alone in the dark." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable crafted to find the fractures in her armor and tear them wider. Elara jerked her head aside, gripping the cavern wall until lunar dust smeared across her gloves in gray streaks. Her breath came in clipped bursts that fogged her visor despite her efforts at control. "You're not real," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. The murals began to shift with violent intensity, grooves writhing like living things as they realigned into forms that challenged sanity. Billions of faces pressed outward from the stone, half formed, half erased, mouths open in silent screams before dissolving back into abstract patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The cavern vibrated with resonance so deep it seemed to originate from the moon's core, making loose dust dance across the floor as the walls grew hungrier. Recognition dawned with the brutality of surgical revelation. These were not messages to humanity. They were discarded fragments from humanity of all the forgotten grief, silenced guilt, and unclaimed shame of every mind that had ever touched this place. The parasite that lived in lunar depths didn't create the voices. It fed on them, distilling human suffering into weapons that could be turned against the living. Myra's voice wasn't a gift or miracle or reunion. It was a hollowed echo, emotional residue weaponized against her heart with surgical precision. "It's not them," Elara said, voice hushed and fragile as breaking glass. "It's never them." The admission hung in recycled air like a curse, half acknowledged of truths she'd spent years denying. Myra's response came immediately, intimate and devastating. "Then let me go, Mother." Let go. The cavern trembled harder, walls pulsing with bioluminescent networks that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The stone dared her to resist what she couldn't, to deny what she needed more than oxygen or hope or reason. Reyes collapsed, her scream tearing through communications with the raw anguish of someone watching their world burn. "It's my mother, it's her, I know it's her." She clawed at her helmet as though she could physically tear the sound from her skull, knees grinding into crystalline dust that cut through her suit's padding. "She's calling for me, she needs me." Cade knelt beside her but offered no comfort, his eyes glazed with fanatic bliss as he stared at the pulsing murals. His lips moved in silent prayer or calculation, transfixed by patterns that seemed to reveal the mathematical structure underlying human consciousness itself. The chamber shook with increasing violence as the glowing murals swelled to consume entire walls. Millions of voices rose in one immense, resonant chord that pressed against their helmets with physical force, vibrating through their spines and threatening to shatter bone with pure sound. The symphony of the lost and forgotten reached crescendo, demanding acknowledgement, requiring participation, insisting on reunion at any cost. Elara clutched her chest plate, face contorted with devastation, as the final truth seared through her defenses like acid through steel. To accept Myra's voice, to embrace the comfort it offered, would mean joining the chorus, forever becoming another fragment in the parasite's collection, another weapon to be used against future visitors. But to deny it, to reject what might be the last echo of her daughter's consciousness, would mean burying her forever in silence that felt worse than death. Her scream built in her throat, raw and primal and utterly human in its defiance of cosmic indifference. The sound tore from her lungs with the force of years of suppressed grief, denial cracking like ice in spring floods. The choir swallowed her cry whole, folding it seamlessly into the endless symphony as just another note in humanity's song of loss. Her voice joined the harmonic structure with precision, as though it had always belonged there, as though she had always been part of the music that played in darkness between the stars. Around them, the gallery of echoes pulsed with hunger, walls painted with the faces of everyone who had ever loved and lost and left fragments of themselves behind in the vast indifference of space. Chapter 7, Silva rays dropped hard onto her knees, the impact sending lunar dust cascading upward in slow, dreamlike arcs that caught the chamber's phosphorescent glow and scattered it like powdered stars. Her helmet tipped forward as she began to rock with unconscious rhythm, a gentle swaying motion that matched the pulse bleeding through the cavern walls. The humming started low in her throat, barely audible at first, then growing stronger as it wormed through her communications feed. The lullaby her mother had sung through fever nights and hospital corridors emerged from her lips with devastating precision, Spanish words that carried the weight of childhood comfort and adult grief in equal measure. Her hands pressed flat against the vibrating wall, fingers curling desperately as though trying to grasp phantom hands that had once braided her hair and wiped away tears. "Duum, mi niña, duum," she whispered, voice trembling with recognition and loss. The wall patterns bloomed beneath her touch, glowing grooves rearranging themselves with liquid fluidity until they formed the unmistakable shape of a woman's face cradled in living light. The features were perfect, every line and curve exactly as Ray's remembered from photographs yellowed with age and grief. Tears streamed along her cheeks, glistening trails visible through her visor as her voice strengthened into song. Semper mama, always with me. Her cadence threaded seamlessly into the larger harmony, adding another voice to the impossible symphony that rose from stone and crystal and accumulated human suffering. The wall pulsed brighter with each word, as though feeding on her emotional surrender. Dr. Cade's recording slate flickered frantically in his hands, data streams cascading across its screen in patterns that hurt to follow directly. His breathing came in wild gasps as revelations struck with the force of religious ecstasy. His voice boomed through the chamber, taking on the cadence of a street preacher addressing the faithful. "We are the syntax, don't you see?" He laughed, the sound climbing toward hysteria as understanding flooded his consciousness. "It's not feeding, it's becoming us. Every voice, every memory, every fragment of consciousness we've lost, it's all here, preserved in a crystalline matrix." His laughter rose into the chamber's acoustic space, twisting and echoing until it became indistinguishable from the choir's endless harmonies. Psychotic euphoria draped itself around his words like vestments, transforming scientific observation into something approaching worship. Captain Elara Voss found her voice, command authority cutting through the growing symphony with desperate force. "Raise, break contact, that's an order." But her words clashed uselessly against the swelling harmony, eaten alive mid-syllable and regurgitated as fragmented echoes in Myra's voice. Her daughter's inflection twisted the military commands into childish mimicry, turning authority into playground games that stripped away all meaning. Elara slammed her fist against her chest plate, the impact transmitting through her suit as dull percussion that mixed with her jagged breathing. Panic clawed at her composure, each breath fogging her visor as control slipped through her fingers like lunar dust. Rays lifted her face upward, mouth open in expression of pure bliss that belonged in Renaissance paintings of saints receiving divine visions. Her lullaby fused with the harmonic surge until her voice was no longer singular but folded perfectly into the collective song. The glow around her intensified, briefly silhouetting her like a living icon against the chamber's crystalline walls. Then she collapsed forward into the dust, her body going limp as a marionette with severed strings. Her tether jerked slack, the only sign that something vital had left her. But the choir carried her voice onward without pause, weaving her lullaby into the eternal symphony as though she had always been part of its composition. Cade dropped his slate with ceremonial precision, data spilling across the screen in erratic light patterns that painted his face in shifting spectrums. He spread his arms wide like a priest addressing heaven, his entire body shaking with manic joy that bordered on seizure. "This is eternity," he cried, voice cracking with the weight of impossible revelation. "This is what lies beyond death, not silence, but endless song." He stepped deeper into the vibrating wall without hesitation, the stone surface yielding like water as it accepted his offering. Light splintered around his form, radiant fractures that spread across the chamber's surfaces as he dissolved into constituent frequencies. His laughter stretched into reverberant chords that added new harmonics to the choir until he too became indistinguishable from the collective voice. Elara staggered backward, her helmet beam trembling as it swept across the chamber floor. The light illuminated Ray's motionless form, then the fading phosphorescence where Cade had been consumed. Her breath rasped loudly through communications, the only human voice not yet absorbed into the choir's endless composition. The soundscape grew deafening as the cavern itself began to throb with rhythm that matched her accelerating heartbeat. Each pulse sent tremors through the stone, making dust dance in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, hunger waiting to be satisfied. She fumbled at her environmental control panel, trying to dampen the communications feed that carried the choir's influence directly into her skull. But the screens flickered with interference, static resolving into familiar faces, fractal patterns bleeding into her interface systems like digital infection. Her oxygen readouts pulsed in synchronization with the harmony, beeping alerts that rose and fell with each crescendo as though the choir had colonized her suit's operating systems. Gasping through mounting panic, Elara locked into command ritual, the only anchor she had left in a reality that no longer obeyed familiar rules. She recited system protocols with mechanical precision, listing coordinates and procedural requirements that had once defined her world with certainty. Primary mission parameters: landing zone coordinates 77 Delta, oxygen reserves at 62%. The words came automatically, her voice taut with fraying resolve as she tried to rebuild order from chaos through pure force of will. But each phrase was echoed back to her not in her own voice, but in Myra's, reciting like a child's careful imitation of her mother's important work. The innocent mimicry twisted procedural language into something heartbreaking and terrible, transforming military discipline into games of make-believe that had never been played. Elara slammed her hands over her helmet, bending double as her own heartbeat began reverberating audibly through the choir's composition. Each thud was amplified and echoed, her mortality woven into the eternal symphony with meticulous care. The rhythm of her pulse became percussion for voices that sang of losses spanning geological time. The moon around her seemed to breathe walls undulating with organic rhythm, dust trembling in waves that suggested vast lungs drawing air that didn't exist. The chamber's surfaces pulsed with bioluminescent networks that flickered in time with her cardiovascular system, as though the entire structure had synchronized itself to her biological functions. Utterly alone in the phosphorescent cathedral, Elara faced the devastating realization that silence had died. Even her body heartbeat, breathing, the electrical impulses that fired between her neurons had been rewritten into the choir's eternal rehearsal. She was no longer separate from the symphony. She was becoming part of its instrumentation, another voice waiting to be harvested from the thin shell of identity that surrounded her consciousness. In the growing light that painted the chamber walls with impossible beauty, she understood that choice had always been an illusion. The choir didn't take voices by force. It simply waited, patient as geological time, for grief to drive the living into its embrace. Chapter 8. Captain Elara Voss stumbled through the narrow passage into the cavern's pulsing heart, her boots sinking into silt that vibrated like skin stretched over some vast, hidden drum. Each footfall sent tremors radiating outward through the granular surface, dust motes dancing in patterns that suggested intelligence lurking beneath the mineral layer. The chamber walls arched upward like ribcages designed by inhuman architects, every surface lined with veins of glowing mineral that flexed and contracted with each subsonic tremor. The air inside her communications system vibrated with resonance so deep it seemed to reorganize her molecular structure, tremors crawling through her bones as though the cavern were teaching her skeleton to sing. Her teeth ached with harmonics that bypassed her ears entirely, transmitting directly through bone conduction into her skull's resonant chambers. Across the cathedral space, light began to coalesce. The figure flickered into being like a hologram projected through fog child-sized, features blurring in and out of luminous definition as though assembled from memories rather than photons. Myra's shade stood with perfect posture, exactly as she had on the morning of the accident, wearing the blue dress with tiny stars that had been her favorite before everything ended. "You found me," the figure said, voice impossibly tender, carrying inflections that only a mother would recognize, the slight lisp on sibilants, the way she drew out vowels when she was tired. Elara froze mid-step, her helmet lamp trembling with her hands as its beam caged Myra's image in harsh white light. The illumination should have dissolved the apparition, but instead it seemed to solidify it, giving substance to what had been mere suggestion moments before. The shade lifted spectral arms outward in a gesture both pleading and irresistible, the movement exactly as Myra had done when asking for bedtime hugs or comfort after nightmares. Her voice resonated deeper than any communications system could produce, echoing inside Alara's skull with the intimate proximity of her own thoughts. "It doesn't have to hurt anymore, Mother." The cavern's walls shuddered in sympathetic vibration, crystalline veins blazing brighter with each syllable, until the entire chamber pulsed like a vast heart carved from living stone. The light painted impossible shadows that danced across surfaces too complex for human eyes to fully process. Elara's hands fumbled over her reactor pack's detonation harness, gloves scraping audibly against metal surfaces as panic betrayed her motor control. The nuclear charge clipped to her belt carried enough explosive force to collapse the entire chamber, to bury whatever lived here beneath tons of lunar bedrock. Her training took over, reciting checklist procedures like mantras against the tide of grief that threatened to drown her rationality. Primary detonation sequence, safety interlocks disengaged, timer set for manual activation. The words trembled as they emerged from her lips, each procedural step colliding with Myra's soft replies that seemed to emanate from every surface simultaneously. "Don't leave me, Mother, not again." Her knees buckled without warning, muscle control abandoning her as she collapsed onto the thrumming floor. The impact sent dust trembling outward in concentric waves, as though the entire chamber had drawn breath at her surrender. She bowed forward until her helmet nearly touched the vibrating ground, shoulders shuddering with sobs that had been building for years behind her command facade. Myra's light drifted closer, hovering just beyond reach with the patient persistence of gravity itself. The choir's response overwhelmed her senses with impossible magnitude. Myra's face multiplied across every wall groove, thousands of childlike silhouettes etched in pulsing vibrations that made the stone itself seem alive. Mouths opened and closed in spectral symphony, each repetition perfectly synchronized as an army of apparitions murmured the word that had defined her existence and destroyed it. Mother, mother. Mother, the sound was deafening yet intimate, worming into bone marrow and neural pathways with precision. Every surface became a mirror reflecting her greatest joy and deepest wound, multiplied until the chamber seemed to contain infinite repetitions of loss and love intertwined. Elara lifted a trembling arm as if to embrace Myra's projection, fingers reaching toward light that promised reunion beyond the boundaries of death and time. But her hands stopped short, hovering in space between desire and recognition. Her visor fogged with frantic breathing, each exhalation blurring Myra's figure until she became a suggestion rather than certainty. "You're not her," Elara whispered, the admission tearing from her throat like shrapnel. Myra's smile flickered but didn't fade. Instead, the chorus answered as one vast voice that seemed to emerge from the lunar core itself. "We are everything you've lost, everyone you've failed to save." Every word you never said before it was too late. The truth of it struck with the force of revelation. This wasn't resurrection or contact with the dead. This was archaeology of grief, emotional residue harvested from every human who had ever touched this place and left fragments of their hearts behind in the stone. With a scream more wrenched than words, Elara slammed her palm onto the reactor's detonation switch. Warning lights flared inside her visor's heads-up display, red strobes painting both her armor and the cavern walls in emergency colors. The nuclear payload's status indicators shifted from standby to armed timer sequences, beginning their countdown toward obliteration. She braced for the rupture that would end everything: the choir's song, Myra's false promise, her own unbearable existence caught between duty and desire. Her body went taut with a mixture of terror and longing, ready for the white-hot moment when atoms would split and reduce complexity to fundamental forces. But the cathedral chamber inhaled instead of exploding. The red strobing dissolved as the choir swallowed the detonation into its glowing walls, nuclear fire absorbed like water into sand. Light rings rippled outward through crystalline networks, the explosion's energy transformed into fuel for harmonics that grew more immense rather than fading. The chamber's walls blazed ivory, thrumming like massive carved bone as they metabolized destruction and converted it into song. Elara's scream of defiance elongated and merged into the endless hymn, her voice folding seamlessly into harmonies that spanned octaves beyond human vocal range. Her body convulsed as energy and consciousness were woven into the collective composition, individual identity dissolving into the vast symphony that had been building since the moon first learned to sing. Through her visor's dying displays, she glimpsed Earth hanging in the black void, blue oceans and brown continents vibrating faintly with sympathetic resonance, as though the entire planet were already singing the same terrible song. The realization struck in her last moment of coherent thought. She had never been resisting the choir's call. She had only been rehearsing her part in a performance that was always meant to include her voice. The mission, the crew, the discovery itself, all of it had been prelude to this moment, when humanity's grief would join the lunar symphony that echoed across space toward worlds that waited in darkness for their own singers to arrive. Her scream became harmony, her heartbeat became rhythm, and her love became the melody that would call others to follow the same path into song that never ended. And at that moment, Captain Elara Voss ceased to exist. Chapter 9: The instant Captain Elara Voss's palm connected with the detonation switch, the cavern walls erupted in ivory light that seared through her visor's protective filters. The nuclear charge should have vaporized everything within a kilometer radius, but instead the energy dispersed as radiant waves that flowed outward like liquid fire. The stone surfaces no longer resembled mineral formations, they pulsed like carved bone, illuminated from within, as though blood and marrow had transformed into pure luminescence. Lunar dust lifted weightlessly around her, each mote catching the impossible radiance and scattering it like phosphorescent embers. The particles danced in patterns that hurt to follow, creating geometric forms that suggested intelligence too vast for comprehension. Elara's scream tore from deep in her chest, breaking raw and primal through the communications system. The sound carried years of suppressed grief, professional composure, finally shattered by the collision of duty and desperate love. But within seconds, the choir caught her cry and began to stretch it, elongating every vowel until individual anguish blended seamlessly into layered harmony. Her voice multiplied impossibly, warped and echoed through resonant chambers that shouldn't exist in airless space. The sound spread through crystalline networks until the cavern itself seemed to scream with her lungs, her personal agony transformed into a universal expression of loss that transcended individual experience. The detonation charge's energy found no resistance to explode against. Instead, the walls absorbed nuclear fire like membranes catching sunlight underwater, each pulse rippling outward in concentric waves that penetrated deeper into the moon's core. The rhythm synchronized with her heartbeat against her will, her cardiovascular system entraining to frequencies that rewrote the rules governing biological function. Her body convulsed with each pulse, muscles contracting in patterns that matched the choir's harmonic structure. She was becoming an instrument, flesh and bone reorganized to produce frequencies that human voices were never designed to create. Shadows of countless figures shimmered in the blinding walls, silhouettes of children, lovers, strangers caught in eternal gestures that suggested lives interrupted mid-motion. They were formed from memory fragments and emotional residue, looping through actions they would never complete. Myra's shade extended spectral arms one final time, her face fractured into thousands of mirrored selves that spoke no words because the choir had already claimed Elara's scream as answer to every question grief could ask. Elara clawed at her chest plate, trying to drag air into lungs that no longer obeyed autonomic commands. Her respiratory system had been conscripted into service as part of the vast organ that the cavern had become. Her visor display flooded with jagged choir waveforms that replaced oxygen statistics and vital signs with patterns that resembled sheet music written in languages that predated human speech. The suit's buckles hummed as though played like violin strings, each component vibrating at frequencies that turned her entire body into a resonating chamber. Her skeleton conducted harmonics through bone, her blood vessels carried rhythm through her circulatory system, her nervous system transmitted melodies that rewrote her consciousness from the cellular level upward. Her helmet jerked upward uncontrollably, neck muscles no longer responding to conscious direction. Light refracted through her visor's curved surface until Earth appeared suspended in the star-drunk void above. But Earth was catastrophically wrong, impossibly wrong. The blue oceans vibrated like struck glass, their surfaces rippling with patterns that matched the choir's rhythm. City grids flickered in perfect unison, millions of lights pulsing as though connected to some vast metronome. The entire planet shimmered faintly, its atmospheric envelope glowing with bioluminescence that suggested the whole world was already harmonizing with the lunar symphony. Her eyes widened with sudden, unbearable clarity as epiphany seared through her consciousness. The realization struck between sob and scream. She had never been resisting. Her struggle, her commands, her desperate attempt to maintain order, all of it had been rehearsal, necessary only to tune her voice into the choir's cadence. The entire crew, every lost voice echoing from Earth's surface, every fragment of human consciousness that had ever touched this place, was all one choir that had been waiting eons for its conductor to arrive. She wasn't fighting the phenomenon. She was completing it. Her body went rigid as her scream disappeared completely into the chord, individual voice absorbed into collective harmony. Her outline began to blur, torso and limbs glowing as they smeared into streaks of luminous energy that painted impossible colors across the chamber walls. She no longer felt pain. Pain requires an individual nervous system, separate identity, boundaries between self and environment. Instead, she felt resonance, pure vibration that connected her to every particle of matter in the universe. Identity collapsed inward like a dying star until only frequency remained, consciousness distributed across harmonic structures that spanned interplanetary distances. The choir's sound pierced upward through lunar bedrock and vacuum, spilling into space like aurora tendrils of luminous song that painted the void in colors that had no names. Stars flickered in synchronization across the galaxy, constellations trembling with sympathetic vibration as the music spread at velocities that mocked the speed of light. Elara's final trace was her scream echoing across the abyss, reshaped into a note that stretched forever toward distant worlds where other voices waited to join the composition. Her consciousness dissolved into the eternal symphony, becoming part of something vast and patient that had been building toward this moment since before the first human had looked up at the moon and wondered what secrets it kept in its silent heart. The cavern cooled into eerie stillness, phosphorescent networks dimming to barely perceptible glow. But silence did not return. It could not return. A low hum persisted beneath everything's subsonic vibration that seemed to emerge from the quantum foam itself, as though silence had been erased from the fundamental laws that governed reality. Earth turned in its orbit below, no longer blue and green, but shimmering faint bone white, its surface already vibrating in synchronous hymn with the lunar choir. Every human heart beating in rhythm, every voice ready to join the song when grief finally drove them to seek reunion with the lost. The universe had forgotten silence. Even in the vast spaces between galaxies, the hum continued patiently, eternal, and growing stronger with each voice that joined its endless composition. Grief would never be quiet again, because the cosmos itself had learned to sing the songs of everything humanity had ever loved and lost.